Good day, everyone. Welcome and thank you for joining the Social Inclusion webinar series. This is the ninth webisode. I wanted to introduce a little bit about this series. The series offers an overview of social inclusion concepts and their practical application in policy and project design. This is especially important for us here at the World Bank as we move towards the implementation of the bank's new environmental and social framework. Addressing inclusion and vulnerability in project design in assessing project risks and impacts, and enhancing development outcomes and project benefits, especially those who experience disadvantage, discrimination, and exclusion, as well as understanding how to meaningfully incorporate social inclusion and development priorities, views, and aspirations of project-affected communities becomes essential to building the foundations of shared prosperity and inclusive development. So inclusion does indeed matter, and I wanted to highlight this World Bank study on inclusion, which is available on the website. It's called Inclusion Matters. Today's discussion focuses on an analytical study on Indigenous inclusion in Latin America in the 21st century. Understanding inclusion with respect to Indigenous peoples is a complex topic, primarily because the development priorities of Indigenous peoples are linked to their rights and relationship to their lands, territories, and natural resources. And the connection between their customs, belief systems, values, languages, cultures, and traditional knowledge and innovations is central to this. As this study points out, Indigenous peoples' ideas of development envision culture not as a means to achieve conventional development goals based on growth and market integration, but rather as a central aspect in defining what type of development is collectively wanted and how it should be implemented. So with that, I welcome my colleague, Germán Freire, who's the lead author for this study, Indigenous Peoples in Latin America in the 21st century. And it's an insightful and comprehensive study. I urge you to read it. It's accessible on the World Bank website. Germán is a social development specialist. He's based in Buenos Aires, Argentina. And just a couple of housekeeping notes, just to remind everyone, this is being recorded and will be posted within 24 hours on the OLC website. And the PowerPoint presentation will be available, as well as past episodes are also available online. So with that, I welcome Germán. While we wait and while we sort this out, I also wanted to introduce myself. My name is Gina Cosentino. I work in the Africa region as a social development specialist consultant, and hopefully will be active in just a moment.
Well, cool. Apparently, I wasn't hearing the introduction by Gina, so I will just start and welcome you all. I hope this little technical glitch will get sorted out while I speak. So thank you for coming, and thank you in particular to the team of the social inclusion at the bank, who not only for allowing for this opportunity, but also for the support they have given us throughout the analytical process that led to this report and all the products that we have been working on. Okay, they are writing that if I can speak louder. There we go. So just let me know. Yeah, I'm reading, so you can write to me and let me know if this is okay or if you want me to stop somewhere. Okay, this group is led by Maitreyi, so thanks to her, and Maria Beatriz, Michelle, Gina on the other side, and Yao, who has put together on this webinar on the technical side. So I will speak about the report, a report that we published we launched in February 2016. But it's actually part of a larger thing that is more than just an analytical side. It's also part of an engagement the World Bank has been having with indigenous and Afro-descendant leaders throughout the Latin America region. And we'll comment on some of the aftermath of this study. So very briefly, I will give you some background, some context, which I think is the most interesting part because it's not necessarily in the report. And we'll talk about the methods and some thoughts on the analytical framework that we use for this particular report, but for others that we're producing. And we'll summarize, rather than going through the report, I will summarize just the first, the main 4 or 5 messages that come out of the report and what those messages have told us at the bank on the operational side and the policy side for the region. So on the background, very briefly, very briefly, the bank, the Latin America region, launched a programmatic agenda for ethnic minorities, which included both indigenous peoples and Afro-descendants in 2013. And it had, as I was saying, 2 main components. One of them was the analytical side that we will be talking today, and the other one, which was really important, was the dialogue with indigenous representatives in the region. And in particular, that dialogue was held through the Foro Indígena Viayala. Foro Indígena Viayala, some of you may know them, some of us don't. It's a network rather than an organization that gathers over 40 indigenous organizations from across the region. Some of them are representative organizations with electoral processes, etc., like the Mesa Indígena of Panama, and some others are NGOs that are either run or owned by indigenous peoples. So this dialogue started in 2013 in the context of the review of the safeguards of the World Bank, and evolved into something much more interesting and more productive, and trying to get the views of the indigenous population in bank operations and actions in the region. This report actually fed a lot from these exchanges, as they were involved from the beginning, from inception. They were in the discussion of the design of the report, and they were also, and we held several meetings throughout the analytical process and discussed the preliminary results with them. We discussed in New York in the World Indigenous Forum the first draft of the result, and then all that was incorporated in the report that you can find in the webpage of the bank. So right now, what this the analytical part is that we are working on a similar report on Afro-descendants, on the status of Afro-descendants in LAC. So the main objective of the report, of the analytical work that we have been doing, was to increase, to deepen the knowledge of the bank on the status of indigenous peoples in the region, with 2 objectives. One was to mainstream solutions for the gaps that we could see in the region in our own operations, but also to look for opportunities to actually open activities exclusively intended to address those gaps, or to trigger policy dialogue with countries. And I will try to mention some of those by the end of the conversation. So from the beginning, this was thought of as an activity that would create bridges of knowledge between the bank and the academia, the governments, and all the interested parties in the region. There are two main sources, if you like. I mean, two main sources of information that have informed the way we have structured our analysis and the presentation of the results. One is the social inclusion report, the work the bank produced and published a few years ago. The idea was that in LAC, the first decade of the millennium was a very positive one. Nearly, I mean, over 70 million people were lifted out of poverty. The middle class expanded to 1/3 of the population. I mean, some call it the golden decade. It was the first time in a long time that the region as a whole moved with very good steps towards the reduction of poverty. But it was a concern that you could also notice that even in these favorable conditions, some groups weren't improving as much. So you had about 1 in 5 Latin Americans were living in chronic poverty, which means that they were poor at the beginning of the decade and they were poor at the end of the decade. So obviously, what was being good for the majority was not good enough for them to help them overcome poverty. And when you zoom in into that group of the population, you see that some groups are more represented than others. No? And indigenous peoples and Afro-descendants are obviously among those overrepresented. In fact, in LAC, the indigenous population is about 8%, 42 million people, but they represent 17% of the people living in extreme poverty. And extreme poverty in LAC means with less than two, at that time meant with less than $2.50 per day per head. Yeah. So that was one important source, the social inclusion lens. We wanted to see, excluded groups face cumulative disadvantages, unequal opportunities, and usually lack of respect and recognition. And those three kind of limit their ability to profit from a good period like the past decade in Latin America. The other important source is, as I was mentioning, the dialogue that we were having with indigenous organizations throughout the region. And just to give you a sense of the kind of influence it had on the analysis, the whole focus of the report shifted as this conversation progressed from a focus on poverty, because in the end the main interlocutors of the bank regionally are governments and ministers of finance who use this language of monetary poverty to communicate what needs to be done, etc. So for them was important. But indigenous leaders in the region actually had some objections to that approach. For them, it was obvious that different people have different ideas of what is that makes you poor and what is that makes a life worth living. So they insisted a lot on kind of polishing that idea. And that led us to shift the focus towards vulnerability, because it kind of broadened the scope in the sense that still we could work on poverty because it's important and because it makes many indigenous, a majority of indigenous population in the region vulnerable. But other aspects started like coming up, like, if you live in an indigenous community in the middle of the Amazon and you are self-sufficient in terms of food, probably the lack of money won't make you vulnerable, or not necessarily, while the lack of land security will make you very vulnerable. So these other aspects started like showing up, no? And that was actually part of the intervention of indigenous leaders on what we were doing. On the data, the numbers I'm going to mention and the trends that we show in the report come from micro data extracted from 16 censuses and data extracted from household surveys from 9 countries. And the dates that we were using for the analysis are the 2000 and 2010, the beginning of the first decade of the millennium and the end of the first decade. On this also, a small comment. Latin America has improved a lot in the production of data on ethnic minorities, indigenous peoples, both and Afro-descendants. And actually now we have a wealth of, most of the countries in the continent reporting on indigenous population. There are still some discrepancies on the way they report, the way the data is being collected and processed, etc. But it's an important improvement. We also reviewed secondary data and regulatory frameworks in the region because, precisely what we wanted to show was if the policy options available were actually on par with the needs of the indigenous population. So, and this analysis of what the data said, what it showed, and the fact that much of the data is relatively new, it has less than 2 decades, led us to some analytical questions like who is indigenous? Although it seems self-explanatory, at least in LAC, no? Who is indigenous? The truth is that this question has become more relevant as new and more progressive legal frameworks protecting indigenous rights have started to appear. And they actually have become controversial in many countries because as some new sets of legislation protect different rights, who is indigenous and who is not has turned into a political dispute as to who is entitled to some of these rights and who is not. I mean, to put it in a concrete example, in Peru in 2012, Congress passed okay, someone is saying if I can speak louder. I will just get the computer closer. In Peru in 2012, the Congress passed a law of prior consultations, and that law implied that if you, I mean, in all sectors that were going to affect or had the potential to affect indigenous collective rights had to go through free, prior, and informed consultation, and in a way consent, because they had to, I mean, the communities had to agree or to inform the design of the projects. It seems straightforward, but when actually the law started being implemented, a discussion started in the country that was really, really intense as to who was indigenous enough to actually be subject of consultation. And to give you an example of how this can get to the heads of people, much of the discussion was around where the Quechua speakers, who are the majority indigenous population who inhabit the Andean regions of the country, where they were indigenous enough. And one of the main arguments was that they had gone through a process of racial mixing. And the other one was related to the fact that Quechua speakers in the Andes tend to refer to themselves as peasants. So even the label that they were choosing, because indigenous communities in Peru is reserved for indigenous peoples in the Amazon region. So the fact that they were calling themselves peasants somehow was used as an argument to discredit their applicability, I mean, their right to contest the application of the law. And this was important because most of the mining in Peru happens in the highlands, and a good deal of the mine sources and the mine projects that are ongoing today happen in this community. So who is and who is not indigenous is actually a contested issue in Latin America, probably more today than a few decades ago. In the graph that we are showing, one of the criteria very commonly used is language. No, it somehow appears that if you are an indigenous person, you ought to have a language other than the dominant language. No, so you ought to speak an indigenous language. And this is information from censuses in 3 countries that actually use 2 criteria to report. The blue bar is self-ascription, and the white bar is the knowledge of an indigenous language. And if you see in countries like Mexico, actually the number of indigenous people who actually speak an indigenous language is less than half the amount of people that self-identify as indigenous persons. Also, this kind of problematizes our analysis because also changes in political scenarios can affect quite significantly the number of people who identified as an indigenous person. In Venezuela, in 1999, the constitution changed completely the terms of relation of the country with the indigenous population. And actually, in the 2001 census, which was the one that followed that important change for indigenous peoples, the indigenous population of the country more than doubled. Yeah, and the following census of 2011, it increased by 50%, by an additional 50%. So these are sort of uncertainties that you have to deal with, are intrinsic to the work with indigenous peoples. And although very often these are seen as opportunistic redefinitions of identity because there are new laws, etc., the truth is, it's more often related to the fact that now they can express something that before was stigmatized or didn't make much sense to express. So even in countries like Uruguay or in Latin America, we have had it as a country that has not had indigenous population for nearly almost 200 years. When the government inserted in the statistics kind of odd questions, it asked people whether you believe to have indigenous ancestry. It turned out that 4% of Uruguayans believe to have indigenous ancestry. And when you look at the data on those 4% of Uruguayans, it's not really the middle class that is identifying as indigenous, as having indigenous ancestry, but rather usually are in the same segment of the indigenous population throughout the region. They are on average poorer, on average have less years of education, and so forth. So this is a kind of note before entering into discussion, because I think it's something that you will face in other regions too, and it's intrinsic to the subject, as I said. So cool. An overview of who they are. The last round of censuses showed that in Latin America we have 42 million indigenous peoples. They are highly heterogeneous. They are grouped in some over 800 different peoples, and they speak over 600 different languages. And they are very unevenly distributed. 4 countries concentrate more than 80% of the indigenous population. Yeah. And those are Mexico, Peru, Guatemala, and Bolivia. But the highest diversity is actually in Brazil, Bolivia, and Colombia, Mexico, and Peru. Brazil alone has about 1/4 of all the cultural diversity in the region. So this is a quick glance at who are we speaking of. Yeah. Something that the report also, the analysis also showed that was kind of puzzling, if you like, for Latin America, was the fact that today nearly 50% of indigenous population in LAC lives in urban environments, and this was actually new for many, strange as it sounds, and it's a challenge for development organizations like the bank, because all the safeguards, all the progressive legislation that has been approved over the past years, everything we have done really on indigenous peoples had an idea of who is indigenous that puts them in the rural area, in traditional environments. And actually, the World Bank, for instance, in the application of safeguards, uses criteria like having an attachment to traditional lands, etc., to be able to screen who is actually indigenous population or not. And actually half of them are living in cities today or in urban environments. And so that poses a new kind of scenario for which we are not prepared. We don't have much information on this population. We don't know what the needs are. We don't know if the strategies that are being proposed actually work. Free, prior, and informed consent, that is something that indigenous organizations push by hard on the political agenda. Does it make sense in an urban environment, or in an urban environment, traditional means of political participation should be enough? We don't know. So this was like a big attention call from the report, no? If you look at how this urban population is in comparison to the rural population, to both indigenous, you start grasping why indigenous peoples are moving to the cities. And it's very similar to the reasons why anybody else moves to cities in the last 2 decades, with the difference that the impact is much stronger. In access to electricity, for instance, I think I have education that access to education in most countries almost doubles for primary level, and if you go to secondary level, access triples and is 4 or 5 times higher for indigenous households who move to urban environments. So there is a big incentive there to move to urban environment. Also, that cannot be denied, there is also the issue of land grabs and disputes over ancestral lands also push them away. In 1/5 of the Amazon rainforest is believed to have potential for mineral exploitation, and 20% of that land is actually indigenous land. So there are processes both at the origin in rural communities, but also pooling factors like better access to services, health, education, etc. So this is an issue that is transversal to the entire report, because we thought it was a very important finding for the region, both for the region and for the bank. And it's something that we have to start working on, and we have actually done some stuff in the past 2 years that I hope I will have time to comment. So what are the main 4 messages of the report? So first, the first decade of the millennium left super important gains. There is no question about that. And one of the main angles is on the angle of recognition and participation. Today, indigenous peoples are involved in decision making at every level. They are politically involved at every level. The president of Bolivia is an indigenous person. But also at subnational level, you have many countries where indigenous political parties are strong, Bolivia, Ecuador, but also Colombia, Venezuela, and you have seen indigenous persons taking decision-making positions by electoral process or also by appointment, virtually everywhere. Funnily enough, there is this discussion in development design on whether indigenous people should be consulted or not, and whether they should give consent or not. And the truth is, in Latin America today, that question is almost an intellectual exercise. They have to get involved because they will. By de facto rule or by law, they will be involved in decision making. So the question is not whether we should or not, but actually how and when. And this is where the discussion is stuck in many countries, whether consultations should happen during design, or it should happen when you have enough information to actually consult something that is solid, or throughout the process, etc. And actually, Latin America during this past 10, 15 years kind of put itself at the forefront in progressive and pro-indigenous legislation. If you know about ILO 169 convention, that is kind of a paradigmatic international convention regarding indigenous people's rights. 22 countries worldwide have ratified it, and of those 22, 15 are in Latin America. So that tells you the impetus of this process of political recognition, in the region. So that's definitely one of the good outcomes of the past decade or 2 decades in the region. The other important gain is definitely the reduction of poverty and the improvement in access to many services, basic and also education and health. In many countries like Peru and Bolivia, poverty in indigenous households was reduced by a third, by a fourth. In Peru, actually, the indigenous poverty went down by 45%. So it's actually very important, like more than a third. Also, access to electricity improved by more than 50% in most countries. And I think the most important outcome of the decade is the access to education. Primary education really expanded to all latitudes. And if you have the fortune to travel through Latin America and indigenous territories, you will find that it's really difficult today to find an indigenous community that doesn't have a school. and actually that schools have become like an open door to many other rights and many other facilities and sets of issues of relations with the West. It's an entry point to the benefits of the states very often. So it's very important in itself. In countries like Nicaragua, Mexico, and Ecuador, actually the gap in access to primary school between indigenous children and non-indigenous children closed. And in other countries, it's below 5%, below 6%, like in Panama, Salvador, Peru. Yeah. So this is, I mean, it's difficult to exaggerate the impact that it's having. Yeah. And also what these gains show is that in a period of good economic conditions like the last decade, uh, with some progressive laws and policies of redistribution, you can actually see change. Yeah, and this is what we have been seeing in the region. But having said that, what we also found is that many gaps remain, and actually some of them have gotten wider, even in the context of the past decade. No? The, in general, poverty among indigenous peoples as an aggregate is almost double, and the probability of indigenous people to live in extreme poverty is 3 times higher than among non-indigenous people. And the problem is that even if the decade was very good for everyone, it was not as good. I mean, it was good for the region, but some people benefited more than others. And indigenous peoples benefited considerably less than non-indigenous. So what you see here in the graph is one example. All countries for which there is data behave more or less in the same way. And you see how in Peru, the poverty line and extreme poverty for indigenous and non-indigenous, even though both of them went down between 2004 and 2012, the gap kind of stayed there all along. So in absolute terms, indigenous peoples were better off at the end of the decade, but in relative terms, actually they were just in the same position. They were in a subaltern position. Yeah. So actually, in some other countries, the gap even expanded. And if in Bolivia, the gap in poverty between indigenous and non-indigenous expanded by 32%, and in Ecuador by 13%, and in Brazil it almost doubled. So yeah, so at the end of the decade, indigenous people were considerably more poorer than non-indigenous people. So this also tells us something about the glass ceilings indigenous peoples find even when they come to urban environments, and even when they have access to education, even when they go to university. And we did some analysis on the returns to education, and you find that even when an indigenous person completes tertiary education, he, considering all the factors equal, like the background, age, gender, where he lives, the type of job he's applying, etc. In Mexico, they are 12% less. They are likely to be paid 12% less than a non-indigenous person, and in rural areas up to 14% less. Yeah, for same types of jobs, same type of background. So this is something that you find in all the countries for which there is data. So if you take two households, we did the exercise of comparing households that were equal. So in many countries, if you take two households in Ecuador who are nearly identical, same number of members, where the household head has the same level of education, where they live in similar neighborhoods, they have all the same socioeconomic conditions, but the only variable difference between them is that the household head in one of the households is indigenous or identifies as an indigenous person, then the probability of living in poverty increases by 15%, only by means of identifying as an indigenous person. If on top of that, the household head of the indigenous household is a woman, then that percentage increases by 6%, the probability of being poor. And if that household lives in a rural area rather than in an urban area, then the probability increases by 26%. So it's not like a small driver of poverty. It's actually a really, really significant driver of poverty for indigenous households. And also the probability that members of that household complete secondary education is reduced by 17%. Yeah. So these are important gaps that actually are explaining much of the difficulty these communities, these people are having to actually overcome poverty, and explain why they are so represented among the chronically poor in the region. So the next, so I think another important message coming out of the report is the idea that new gaps are emerging. I mean, the conditions of many indigenous households are changing in the sense we now have, I mean, we know that 50% of them at least are living in urban environments, probably more, and this is only probably going to increase over time because this is one of the most urbanized regions in the world. So what are the conditions of them in those cities? And we find that when you analyze, you use the UN Habitat description of slums and you apply it to indigenous peoples and non-indigenous peoples living in urban environments, you find that 1 in 3 indigenous households live in slums, yeah, which means in neighborhoods with poor access to services, neighborhoods with poor economic opportunities, neighborhoods more exposed to crime and violence. And remember that Latin America is the most violent region in the world, etc., etc. Also, neighborhoods that come with a stigma, so actually limit your economic possibilities and your opportunities in the urban environment, etc. No? And to give you a reference, this is almost double the probability of non-indigenous people in the region to live in a slum. So also indigenous peoples are getting jobs in the low skill, low paying segment of the job market. Yeah, they mostly get jobs in informal economies. Yeah, they don't tend to have security, social security, pension, etc. Indigenous women is kind of they have a kind of contradictory situation because in urban environments very often they liberate from some traditional roles that actually put them in a subaltern position. So that's a good outcome, and that explains why very often it's more often rural women who are moving to cities than rural men. But also in cities, indigenous women earn as nearly half as half the amount that men will earn. So they have more problems to get access to the job market, and they get inserted in manual jobs. Yeah. There are also growing internal gaps within indigenous societies, and that was an important insight for the bank because, and I think for the region, because when we speak of indigenous population, we tend to use this word as a catch-all phrase for things that are very different. You know, you have isolated peoples in the Amazon and urban peoples in El Alto in Bolivia, and you are putting them under the same social category, if you like, and applying the same kind of policies and using the same development logics or rationale for those two very, very difficult social settings. So, and what we see is that with the mass migration of indigenous population to urban environments, we are also having that it's two very different types of forms of exclusion, the ones that are enduring indigenous households in cities versus the ones that they are enduring in rural areas. You have large societies like the Quichua speakers, and then the Shuar, 50,000 people in the Amazon, you know. So we also need to account for that diversity, because that diversity is actually in need of different sets of policies, and probably what works in one environment doesn't work in another. And this is something that wasn't present in discussions at the bank or out there in the government. We tend to have one set of policies. I mean, we need free prior and informed consent, and this should be a solution to participation to all indigenous peoples in all possible scenarios. And that's not necessarily true, yeah. So we concluded that we had to pay more attention to that. And the last message I want to leave is the message of, okay, we had an expansion of the education system to these areas that was phenomenal, yeah. I mean, no one can argue against that. We have an expansion in access to other services like electricity, water, etc. Many indigenous peoples went, saw poverty go down for the first time in many, many decades. But we need to have a conversation on the quality of those services, yeah? And in particular, in what regards education and health delivery, yeah? And this graph is, what it shows you is the correlation between the level of education attained by indigenous people in the region in some countries, there are countries for which we have data, and the percentage of them that spoke an indigenous language by the time they completed that level of education. The reason why we did this analysis is that because it is a proxy for cultural loss and for the loss of other assets as well, besides the fact that the language is an asset in itself. No? And what you find is that by the time an indigenous kid completes primary education, the probability that he or she will speak an indigenous language is less than 35%, which is the second column in the graph. And by the time he or she completes secondary education, the probability that she speaks an indigenous language, it will be less than 5%. And by the time that she completes tertiary education, the probability that she will speak an indigenous language is less than 2%. So it tells you that there is a strong correlation between formal education and loss of assets. Yeah, and this, I mean, we had the data to prove this correlation in language loss, but actually many other studies have done the same correlation for ethnobotanical knowledge, for medical knowledge, for I don't know, for social safety nets in the community, for traditional forms of organization, etc. So it is a big issue. I mean, in the conversations with Abby Ayala, we were saying like education doesn't have to become a zero-sum kind of decision. Well, if you're an indigenous parent, either you send your kids to school and then they are prepared for the market, or they remain indigenous, so don't send them. I mean, they actually, it should be a bridge between the two worlds, and there is lots of experience in Latin America that it can actually work in that direction. Just for a footnote to that comment, Latin America has been experimented with bilingual education and intercultural more recently, at least since the 1940s. Yeah, so it's not a new idea. The idea that you can actually try to bridge the two worlds through the education system. But when you look at what is being done on the field, I mean, the region has been very, very focused on expanding access and has done less focus on the quality of the service that is being delivered. The same for education, etc. So, okay. So we did a series of recommendations for the region. I mean, from the beginning, the idea of this report wasn't really to come up with a list of policy recommendations or operational recommendations. The idea was to try to see what is it that we were not seeing that explains why this population, indigenous people, are actually not benefiting as much from the good economic growth of the past 10 years. Yeah? And what is it that is needed extra for them to actually be able to lift themselves out of poverty in their terms, no? Respecting the fact that they might have priorities that are different from ours, as I was saying at the beginning. No? Maybe isn't economic poverty the main driver in their lives. So, but when you took other proxies like land rights, etc., the evolution is more or less similar. So we need to do some extra work. Basically, in 2 or 3 ideas, the main recommendations of the report is that we have to work more on inclusion and also on the quality of inclusion. I mean, we have come to the point where consulting indigenous peoples is a standard. We need to do it. Now we need to work on, okay, what's the content of that consultation? What is it that they are contributing with, and how is it that we are incorporating it in projects, etc. Because experience shows that only if they are participating, projects are likely to succeed in this environment. Also, this issue of adapting services to their realities, to their cultures. We need to work more on intercultural and bilingual education, or an alternative to it, but something has to be done in the face of education not fulfilling the purpose of preparing them both to be better indigenous adults and better prepared for national societies in which they are inserted. And finally, the idea that I mentioned throughout the conversation, that we need to address new realities. We need to start thinking of what is the reality of indigenous peoples living in urban environments. I mean, do they have special needs? They obviously live in conditions that need some support. So what are these conditions? What are the strategies that we have? Are we getting there or not? And with that, I see Gina on the screen, so I suppose that means that I ran out of time. So I will just leave the rest if you have questions or comments, and we build from that. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Herman. That was so insightful and so fascinating, actually. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Fine. Are you able to hear me?
Yeah,
okay, fine. Good. It's all working again. So while people are posting questions, I wanted just to start off with a couple, if that's okay. So in my initial remarks, which I know you couldn't hear, but I mentioned I actually cited the report, and I wanted you to comment on it a little bit more. The report states Indigenous peoples' ideas of development envision culture not as a means to achieve conventional development goals based solely on growth, on market integration, but rather as a central aspect in defining what type of development is collectively wanted and how it should be implemented. So I wanted to give you an opportunity for you to expand on what this implies for the work of development institutions like the World Bank, in terms of how we do our development and incorporating Indigenous peoples into sharing their ideas on development and how we do our work.
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, that was actually part of what came out during the conversations with the indigenous leaders themselves. No? The idea that, very often when we think of development, we think what is it that we can contribute to their development, not like maybe in a less patronizing way, but this is the underlying assumption. And very rarely we take into account their views how can they contribute to our development? Yeah, there is evidence that this is a two-way relationship around you. It's difficult to look at something around us that hasn't been influenced by indigenous knowledge. No, so still the best treatment to malaria is still quinine, which is a product that Amazonian people were using to lower the fever. People hundreds of years ago. But also food, staple foods like corn and manioc, etc., dominate our diet. But more to the point of what we were saying there in the report is that for indigenous people, for indigenous leaders, just a background. The last in 2015 finished the second international decade of the UN devoted to indigenous peoples, and in 2004 the first decade. So one of the conversations at that time when we were working on this was, okay, what's the advance of the decade? And there wasn't much. Yeah, aside from the political advance, there wasn't much to show in 2004. And actually, there are two brilliant works by Harry Patrinos at the bank who he did an analysis at the beginning of the decade, 1994, and then at the end. And actually, he came up with really a very sovereign assessment of progress, and then there wasn't much. Yeah. So indigenous representatives have an objection to actually the indicators that were being used. So the point was, okay, but what is it that you are assessing? First of all, are you assessing something that is relevant to us or not? Yeah, and we haven't had that conversation before. And also, once you know what is relevant to us, how do you assess progress towards that? yeah, because maybe the measures that we are using are not relevant. So this is a caveat that we have always to have in mind when we engage for development with the indigenous population. And just to give you a quick example of the potential of indigenous perspectives on development in Brazil in 2012, I think, a report was published which had assessed deforestation between 2002 and 2012 or 10, something like that. And they had assessed deforestation both inside indigenous territories and outside them to see how had been the progress of the past 10 years. And what they found is that inside indigenous territories, deforestation had been under 0.6%, while outside it had been over 7%, which meant that outside indigenous territories, they were contributing 27 times more carbon dioxide emissions to global change, to climate change. So it's not only that land rights has a benefit for indigenous communities for their own benefit, but actually it is proved that it has a benefit for all. No? They are the holders of, or the keepers of over 80% of the biodiversity in the planet, being only 5% of the population. So there is a trade-off in, I mean, social inclusion should happen because it should happen because it's the right thing to do, etc. But there is also a trade-off for the majority population in actually protecting their rights and including them more fairly in development. So I think that's some of the ideas of how this should affect our work and the way we should probably change the lens sometimes and think how can I benefit from them, in the good sense of benefiting from them.
You've touched on it, such an important point. I think it's worth expanding on a little bit more. I mean, the problem or the issue of deforestation is a worldwide problem, especially on indigenous territories. And about 70 million indigenous peoples worldwide are actually dependent on their forests for all aspects of their livelihood, spiritual, cultural well-being. And as you mentioned, they're also extremely important for keeping ecosystems healthy. Work that they do using their traditional knowledge, as you mentioned. But as you know, while there is oftentimes less deforestation when they have land title, it's still, and this is a worldwide phenomenon as well, there's a lot of encroachment taking place on indigenous territories, and I know this is taking place in Brazil and in Colombia and other countries in the Amazon especially. So what do you think could be done from a development perspective in terms of strengthening their rights to their land and ensuring that they have proper monitoring, etc., so that not only do they get to remain on their lands, but they have what they need to be able to fend off encroachment of their territories.
Yeah. No, we actually didn't go too deep into issues of land rights and encroachment, etc. Because I mean we had the time that we had. No, we focus on the narrative of vulnerability and education in particular. But something that has been found in the region that is I think is relevant to your question is that legislation often is not enough. And the same report that I was just mentioning on deforestation in Brazil also found that, when you take two countries that have equal regulation, of protecting indigenous land, like Peru and Brazil, the difference between Peru and Brazil the past decade is that Brazil had enforced the legislation. So indigenous communities not only had the rights to their lands, etc., but actually some monitoring mechanisms were in place. The government was responsive to complaints from indigenous communities to this sort of things like encroachment, etc. And you have these results. Peru actually has a fairly advanced legislation in that sense, but actually the enforcement is close to zero. Yeah, for many reasons, not only lack of political will, but also Amazonian communities. The Amazon in Peru is an area of more difficult access. I mean, there are regions like the Ene River where you still have some pockets of drug trafficking and violence, etc. So even having the regulations and even granting the land titles to indigenous communities in these conditions, it didn't make much change much. I mean, they didn't change much. And in fact, the, the fact that they were unprotected kind of boosted abuse of these lands, etc. So I think one of the keys is to enforce the legislation, and there is a gap and attention that is difficult to miss in LAC related to how advanced legal frameworks are and how slow the implementation of those frameworks is. Yeah. So this is a tension that has to be sorted out. You have experiences from other countries. You know, in the bank in Indonesia, the PNPM project has advanced a lot on transparency and community-driven development, etc., with a much weaker legal framework. Yeah, and they have advanced much more probably than I've seen in Black in any country. So, but it doesn't mean that the legislation is not important. It is important because it's the point of departure. The other aspect is obviously to get them involved. No, I mean, how do you make sure they actually have the capacity to monitor? How do you make sure? I mean, something that has to be worked more, and something that the bank has been doing with Aviala, I feel like, is how you improve transparency and representativeness in indigenous organizations. I mean, very often indigenous organizations are hijacked by indigenous leaders, but you know that maybe are not as representative of the common of his or her constituency. So you know, and you can always say this is a process that they have to do on their own, but the truth is that the states have a responsibility to actually make sure people are fairly represented, etc. So you can do more, and it implies support in logistics, for instance, support in helping them adopt more transparent mechanisms, always respecting their own customs and
It
laws.
seems. Well, thank you so much, Herman. I have so many other questions that I'd love to ask you, and I know some of our other participants as well, related to quality education, to the impact of urbanization on livelihoods and culture, and cultural resilience. So I mean, we could go on and have a day-long session, I'm sure. So I urge everyone who's listening to go on our website and download the report. It's a fascinating report. It's applicable to the work not only in Latin America, but it does raise very important questions for the work that we do with Indigenous peoples around the world. So I think it's a very timely report, and I hope that more of you have a chance to take a look at it. And with that, I want to thank Herman for sharing your insights and congratulate you and your team on producing a fantastic report and adding to the conversation on inclusion in Indigenous peoples. So thank you very much, and thank you for everyone for attending.
Thank you so much. Bye.